They chose her own birthday, to do it. Her mother-in-law stepped into the garden holding a sealed envelope like a verdict already decided, dressed not for a party, but for judgment. Her husband avoided her eyes. The music dipped, conversations thinned, and the air shifted. Her triplet daughters instinctively reached for each other's hands. When no one realized, Lenora had been waiting for this exact moment. The garden looked perfect that evening, almost too perfect. Strings of light stretched from post to post, crisscrossing overhead like someone had carefully arranged the stars just a little lower. Round tables draped in white linen stood neatly in place, flowers spilling color into every corner. A banner above the entrance read, "Happy Birthday, Lenora," swaying gently in the breeze like it believed the lie it was telling. Neighbors and family friends arrived dressed for celebration. Children ran freely across the grass. A speaker near the fence played something soft and warm that wrapped around the space like comfort. It all looked right. It almost felt right, at least in the beginning. Lenora stood beside the main table in a soft ivory dress, 42 years old, carrying herself with the kind of grace that only comes from surviving things you never speak about. There was a stillness in her that people often misunderstood as shyness. It wasn't. It was control, a silence built from knowing more than she ever revealed. Nearby, her daughters, Nia, Celine, and Dara, ran through the garden in matching yellow dresses, their laughter bright and careless, the kind that only comes when the world hasn't shown its teeth yet. When Lenora watched them, something in her softened every time, like whatever weight she carried quietly stepped aside just long enough for her to breathe. She poured herself a glass of lemonade and stood at the edge of it all, observing, always observing. Kofi arrived late, not casually late, but deliberately so, the kind that spoke without words. He walked in with his phone still in his hand, barely scanning the scene, and instead of going to his wife, he went straight to his mother. Claudette stood tall in deep navy, her posture rigid, her presence sharp, like a woman who had long ago decided kindness was a liability. Kofi leaned in close, whispering something only she could hear. She gave a small, knowing nod. That moment didn't go unnoticed. Not the birthday woman, but the late husband and his mother sharing secrets. Then, as if nothing mattered, Kofi drifted toward his friend Deshawn, the two of them laughing in a corner like they were untouched by the tension quietly building. Lenora saw it all. She always did. She just never reacted the way people expected. Instead, she took a slow sip of lemonade, smiled politely at a neighbor offering birthday wishes, and carried on as if nothing had shifted. Then Renee walked in, early 30s, dressed just a little too perfectly, the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but took it anyway. No invitation, no hesitation. She entered like she belonged, and Kofi confirmed it with a casual wave, introducing her as a colleague. Some guests nodded. Others exchanged glances they tried to hide. Lenora noticed. Of course she did, but her expression didn't move. She simply placed her glass down, walked over to her daughters, and gently fixed the bow on Dara's dress, as if grounding herself in something real. The toast was meant to be simple. A husband honoring his wife, laughter, applause, children sneaking bites of cake before dinner. That's what everyone expected. But expectations have a way of collapsing at the worst possible moment. Claudette stood without invitation, lifting her glass and striking it with a spoon, the sharp sound cutting through the garden. One by one, voices fell silent until the entire space was listening. And Lenora didn't look surprised at all. People turned as one, drawn by the sharp authority in Claudette's posture as she straightened and began to speak. Not a toast, not a tribute, but what she coldly declared as the truth. Her voice cut clean through the evening as she accused Lenora of wasting 20 years of her son's life, claiming she had stayed silent only out of respect for the marriage. But that silence, she said, had expired. She insisted Lenora was never the woman Kofi deserved, that something about her had always felt wrong, and that any real wife would have recognized it and stepped aside long ago. The garden froze. The music stopped, or maybe it just disappeared beneath the weight of her words. Guests avoided eye contact, staring at their laps, the sky, anywhere but at Lenora. Kofi stood off near the fence, hands buried in his pockets, saying nothing, staring at the ground as if it might answer for him. Deshawn scrolled through his phone, detached. Renee lingered by the dessert table, a faint, knowing smile playing at her lips. Then Claudette reached into her handbag and pulled out a sealed envelope, walking slowly across the garden with rehearsed precision, like someone stepping into a moment she had planned for years. She placed it beside the untouched birthday cake and looked Lenora straight in the eye. "Consider this a gift." Nia grabbed her mother's hand first. Celine pressed close to her other side. Dara, youngest by just 4 minutes, began to cry silently, tears slipping down her cheeks without sound. Lenora looked down at her daughters, steady and calm, placing one hand on Nia's shoulder and the other gently on Dara's face, wiping her tears with quiet care. Then her gaze lifted to the envelope, to Claudette, to Kofi, who still said nothing. She gave a single, slow nod. Not defeat, not surrender. The kind of nod that said she had already seen this coming. The kind that meant a line had just been crossed that no one else yet understood. What Claudette didn't know, what Kofi didn't know, what no one in that garden could have imagined, was that every inch beneath their feet belonged to Lenora. Every flower, every light, every carefully arranged table. This entire world they stood in was hers, the beginning of a $17 billion empire rooted right there in that moment. And just like that, the birthday party stopped being a celebration and became something else entirely. To truly understand Lenora, you have to go back, long before the lights, the dress, the envelope, to a small rural town in Georgia where red clay roads stretched endlessly and wooden porches held generations of stories, where mornings smelled like pine and fresh baking. That was her origin. That was her foundation. Her parents died when she was 7, taken suddenly in a car accident on a wet November night, the kind that changes everything without warning. Lenora never remembered it clearly, only fragments. Her grandmother's arms pulling her close, the sensation of being carried, the scent of lavender, cedarwood, and something floral that always lingered in Nana Bree's home. And somewhere in that haze of grief, she made a decision, not out loud, not for anyone else, but deep within herself, that she would survive. The way a seed decides to break through concrete, quietly, without permission. Nana Bay was small in stature, but never in strength. A woman who worked land passed down through generations, tending a garden that carried them through the harshest winters. She believed in faith not as an idea, but as something she had witnessed, something real. She didn't raise Lenora to be loud or confrontational. She raised her to be steady, rooted, unmovable in the quiet way trees withstand storms. And just before she passed, when Lenora was 19 and beginning her first year of college, her grandmother placed something small and cold in her palm, something that would later change everything. It was a pendant, simple at first glance, hanging from a thin chain, brass molded into the shape of an old skeleton key, its edges softened by generations of touch. It had belonged to Nana Bay's mother, and to hers before that, passed down not as decoration, but as something heavier, something understood without explanation. Nana Bay closed Lenora's fingers around it that day, her gaze steady, searching, as if she could see straight through to the parts of Lenora the world would never reach. "This is not just jewelry, baby," she told her quietly. "It's a reminder. Everything locked will open when the time is right." And Lenora never took it off. Not through college, not through graduate school, not while quietly building what would become one of the most powerful private holding companies in the region, not through her marriage to Kofi, not through the births of her daughters, and certainly not through the quiet humiliation she learned to endure. She wore it that night in the garden too, resting against her skin like it always had, just beneath her throat as Claudette delivered her performance. She had met Kofi in their 20s, back when charm was enough to disguise a lack of depth, when warmth could pass for substance. He had been easy to love then, the kind of man who made spaces feel brighter simply by entering them. And she had loved him the way young people do, completely, without asking the questions that matter later. She cooked for him with genuine joy in those early years, read bedtime stories to their daughters using 3 different voices so each child felt seen, built a home that felt whole from the outside. And quietly, behind it all, she maintained something else entirely. Monthly calls to her attorney, Mr. Ellington, reviewing assets, adjusting structures, reinforcing layers no one else even knew existed. She never told Kofi the full truth about what she had built. Not because she was hiding, but because she was watching. Nana Bay had taught her that a woman who understands her worth doesn't need to announce it. And a woman who truly sees someone will never be blindsided by who they become. Lenora had watched long enough. She knew exactly who Kofi was now. She had known for a while. The woman they tried to humiliate in that garden was never who they believed she was. They mistook her silence for weakness, her calm for lack of options. But Lenora's silence was never empty. It was controlled, deliberate, carrying more than anyone around her could comprehend. After that night, things didn't explode, they unraveled. Quietly, the way betrayal always does. Kofi began coming home later and later, until late stopped meaning anything at all. And when he was home, he wasn't present. Sitting at the table with his phone turned face down, his attention somewhere unreachable, far from the family he once claimed to value. Conversations disappeared. Questions went unanswered. The distance that had been building for 2 years solidified into something colder, something permanent. And behind it all, Claudette moved quickly. She had never accepted Lenora. Not from the first introduction, not at the wedding, not during pregnancies or the years that followed. She had simply been waiting. Now she acted. Piece by piece, she constructed a narrative for Kofi, feeding it to him slowly. Convincing him Lenora had married into the family for security, that her past was something she had concealed, that her love had never been real, only strategic. And then she offered him a replacement. Someone appropriate. Someone equal. Someone like Renee. What Kofi didn't fully see was how carefully this had all been arranged. Claudette met privately with a family attorney, sharing only selective details with her son, enough to make him believe he was being protected, that everything was fair, that Lenora would leave with what was reasonable, but nothing more. Documents were placed in front of him, and he signed them without question, without reading, trusting his mother the way he always had, blindly. And Renee wasn't just opportunistic. She was precise. For 14 months, she had been weaving herself into Kofi's life with calculated patience, placing herself exactly where she needed to be, saying exactly what needed to be said, moving like someone who wasn't hoping for an outcome, but orchestrating one that Renee didn't just appear, she positioned herself. First at professional events Kofi attended, then at small dinners with mutual friends, and before long, she was inside their home at a family cookout Lenora hadn't even known she'd been invited to. She spoke to the daughters with unsettling precision, the kind of warmth that felt practiced, like she was rehearsing for a role she fully intended to claim. She brought Nia a science book she had clearly researched beforehand, praised Celine's drawings with just the right amount of admiration, and called Dara by a nickname only her sisters used, a detail that did not escape Lenora, though she said nothing. Renee fed Claudette a steady stream of insight. Kofi's moods, his financial concerns, his quiet insecurities, making herself valuable to everyone except the one woman whose place she was slowly trying to take. The weeks after the birthday party pressed in hard on Lenora, not because she was falling apart, but because she refused to. She held herself steady while everything she had built with Kofi unraveled piece by piece under the weight of his choices, all while shielding her daughters from the full truth. Nia barely touched her food at dinner. Celine refused to sleep without the lights on. And one night, as Lenora braided Dara's hair, the question finally came, soft, fragile, impossible to ignore. Is Daddy going to leave? Lenora didn't lie. She didn't offer empty comfort either. She kept braiding, her hands steady, and said quietly, whatever happens, you and your sisters will always have me. All of me. That will never change. Dara looked at her mother's reflection and nodded slowly, the same quiet, knowing nod Lenora had given Claudette in the garden. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Lenora walked back into the garden alone. The party was gone now, the lights taken down, the banner removed, the laughter replaced by silence. She sat at the same table where the untouched cake had once rested, surrounded by nothing but darkness and memory. For a long time, she didn't move. She let herself think of her grandmother, of red clay roads, of cedar-scented mornings, of the brass key resting against her chest. And for the first time in weeks, she let herself feel everything she had been holding back. The quiet grief of a marriage already gone, the anger she refused to display, the unshakable love she had for her daughters. The tears came softly, controlled, the way hers always did, and she wiped them away, straightened her posture, looked up at the night sky like she was confirming something only she understood. And then she reached for her phone and made one call. Mr. Ellington answered on the second ring, as he always did. His voice was steady, familiar, grounding. "It's time, Ellington," she said. There was no hesitation on the other end, no questions, no speeches. He had stood beside her for 18 years. He understood exactly what those words meant. "Everything is ready, Lenora," he replied. "It has been ready." She thanked him, ended the call, and remained in the garden a while longer. Not broken, not defeated, but poised like a woman standing at the edge of something irreversible, about to unlock a door that had been closed for far too long. The gala came days later, the most anticipated event of the season, hosted in the courtyard of a newly restored art center in the center of the city. White tents stretched elegantly across the grounds, their frames wrapped in ivy and soft, glowing lights, the kind of setting designed to impress. But that night, it would become the stage for something no one saw coming. Round tables glowed under candlelight, each flame flickering softly against the evening air while a live quartet played near the garden entrance, filling the space with elegance that felt almost staged. Women arrived draped in evening gowns, men in sharply tailored suits. This was where the city's most prominent black families gathered, not just to celebrate, but to be seen, to give, to belong to something bigger than themselves. Everyone who mattered was there. Kofi moved through the crowd with practiced ease, Claudette at his side in striking red, Renee on his arm. The three of them presenting a polished image of unity as they greeted guests and accepted compliments. Claudette thrived in it, absorbing attention, reinforcing the story she had been carefully shaping for weeks. The devoted mother who had stepped in and saved her son. And people believed it, because people tend to believe what's presented with enough confidence. Then Lenora arrived, late, alone. She entered through the main gate in a deep burgundy gown that didn't beg for attention, but demanded it anyway, her presence shifting the atmosphere the moment she stepped inside. The brass key pendant rested against her throat, unchanged, unwavering. She walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but because she had never rushed toward anything she already understood. Conversations quieted near the entrance. Glasses paused midair. The silence that followed her wasn't discomfort. It was recognition, the unspoken awareness that something significant had just stepped into the room. She greeted a few familiar faces with quiet warmth, accepted a glass of water from a passing server, and took her seat near the center of the tent with the calm assurance of someone who owned more than just her place in the room. Because in truth, she did. Across the tent, Kofi saw her, and something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, something heavier, more uncertain. The look of a man beginning to realize he had misjudged a situation, but not yet grasping the full cost of that mistake. At the front, the evening's host, Dr. Okafor, a respected physician and philanthropist known for building institutions across the city, stepped to the microphone. The quartet faded into silence as the crowd settled. She thanked everyone for attending, spoke briefly about the significance of the Arts Center, then paused, her tone sharpening slightly as she introduced what she called the most important announcement of the night. She revealed that the gala, the entire renovation behind them, and the scholarship fund launching that evening had all been made possible by a single private contribution, one that had been quietly operating in the community for nearly 20 years, building, investing, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Then she said the name, Nanabia Holdings, LLC. The air shifted, not loudly, but deeply, the kind of silence that follows when something lands before it's fully understood. Dr. Okafor then invited the founder to come forward. Lenora calmly set her glass down. She rose without hesitation, smoothing the front of her gown, and walked toward the microphone with that same steady, grounded presence that had carried her through everything. She didn't glance at Kofi. She didn't acknowledge Claudette. She faced the crowd, and in 4 minutes, just 4, she changed everything. She spoke her grandmother's name first, letting it settle into the space like something sacred. She said that everything she had built began with a woman on a red clay road in Georgia who understood that dignity isn't something you perform. It's something you live quietly, consistently, whether anyone is watching or not. It was something you protected. Lenora said she had spent years building in silence because her grandmother taught her that the loudest thing a woman can ever do is outlast everything that tried to break her. She thanked Mr. Ellington, seated quietly near the back with that same calm, knowing smile, then turned her gaze toward her daughters, Nia, Celine, and Dara, dressed in deep burgundy like reflections of her strength, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. She smiled at them, and they smiled back, a silent exchange that said more than words ever could. Then she stepped away from the microphone, and the screen behind the tent came to life. Clean, precise, undeniable. It displayed the profile of Nanabia Holdings, total asset valuation, $17.3 billion. Properties spanning 6 states. Mineral rights rooted in inherited land. 2 decades of calculated legal strategy. Real estate. Private equity. A foundation built to give back. And then, near the bottom, almost casually listed, a residential address. The house. The same house Kofi and Claudette had already imagined as theirs once the divorce was complete. The crowd read it once, then again, and then it clicked. The shift was instant. Kofi's face went completely still, the kind of stillness that comes when a person realizes every belief they stood on was never real to begin with. He stood frozen, drink in hand, not even remembering to lift it. Claudette tightened her grip on her clutch, her eyes darting between the screen and Lenora, her control slipping in quiet, visible fractures. Renee looked from Kofi to Claudette and back to the screen, and something in her expression changed, a calculation fast and cold, adjusting to a reality she hadn't planned for. The murmurs began as whispers, then grew, spreading through the tent like a rising tide. People leaned in, connecting the dots, the birthday, the envelope, the public humiliation, the woman who had said nothing, who had simply nodded once and held her daughters close. That woman owned everything. And then Lenora turned and walked out. On her way, she passed Kofi. She didn't pause, didn't speak, didn't even look at him with anger or satisfaction. She simply walked by, steady and composed, and as she did, her fingers rose briefly to touch the brass key resting at her throat, the same quiet gesture she had made every day since she was 19. Some thought it was for him. It wasn't. It never was. It was for Nana Bay. It had always been for Nana Bay. The divorce followed, but not in the way Claudette had so carefully planned. The documents Kofi had signed without reading, the ones placed in front of him with quiet assurance, carried clauses his own attorneys would later describe as devastatingly one-sided. Without realizing it, he had given up protections, claims, leverage he thought he still held. And when the full scope of Lenora's financial reality surfaced, the aggressive legal strategy his team had prepared quietly collapsed into damage control. The house he believed he would keep was transferred cleanly back into Lenora's trust. The assets he assumed were shared turned out never to be his. His financial standing, while not ruined, shrank sharply against the version of it he had believed in. And the consequences didn't stop there. His reputation shifted just as quietly, just as powerfully. The truth moved through their social circle the way it always does. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, correcting every false assumption people once held. The same neighbors who stood in that garden. The same guests who watched Claudette deliver that envelope. They understood now, and they adjusted. Some said nothing to Kofi at all, but their silence spoke louder than anything they could have said. They didn't confront him, didn't argue, didn't create scenes. People simply disappeared. Calls stopped. Invitations faded. His name quietly slipped off guest lists, which in its own way felt like a final judgment no one needed to say out loud. Renee was gone within 2 weeks of the gala. His last 3 messages sat unanswered, and she was soon seen at another dinner, on someone else's arm, laughing the same effortless laugh she had worn at the birthday party. Unbothered, untouched, already rewriting her story without him in it. Kofi had mistaken her attention for care, never realizing she had been studying him like an investment, and the moment the numbers changed, so did she. Claudette carried her consequences. Differently, silently but visibly. Pride kept her from admitting anything, but the shift around her was undeniable. The same community she had staged that birthday humiliation for had been present the night everything unraveled. The same faces, the same witnesses. Some chose politeness and said nothing. Others didn't bother. Either way, the result was the same. Her son diminished, the woman she tried to break standing untouched, and the audience she had once performed for now fully aware of the truth. Nia, Celine, and Dara chose to stay with their mother. There were no arguments, no drawn-out battles. Just a quiet, undeniable decision. Kofi saw it in their eyes one evening and understood. He couldn't fight for something he had already given up. He would still be their father, but from a distance he had created himself, a distance that would take years to truly understand. There's a kind of loss that doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in slowly, almost invisibly. The loss of being truly seen, not admired, not respected, just seen for who you really are, and realizing the people who once looked at you with belief now look at you with nothing at all. No anger, no admiration, just the absence of illusion. That became Kofi's reality. Not the loss of money, not the house, but the weight of being fully understood at last. The garden was quiet again at 6 in the morning. No lights, no music, no decorations. Just the space itself, stripped back to what it had always been. The old oak tree stood near the fence. The flower beds Lenora had planted years ago remained untouched. The stone path curved gently from the house to the table at the center. Everything was still. Lenora sat there with a cup of tea, both hands wrapped around it. Not lost in thought, but doing something far rarer. She was resting. Truly resting, the way someone does when the storm they've been bracing for has finally passed, and their body no longer has to hold the tension. Her fingers rose to the pendant at her throat, the brass key warm against her skin. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting memory drift in. Wooden porches in Georgia, the scent of lavender and cedarwood, her grandmother's hands pressing that small, cold key in her palm, that voice reminding her that everything locked would open when the time was right. When she opened her eyes again, the world felt quieter, clearer. She looked toward the oak tree just as the back door opened. All 3 girls came running out at once, still in their pajamas. Nia first, her hair tousled from sleep, Celine behind her with one sock half on, and Dara racing barefoot down the stone path, calling Mama before she even reached her. Lenora turned and opened her arms, and they fell in her all at once. Nia to her side, Dara in the middle, Celine pressing in close. The tea nearly tipped over, but it didn't matter. Nothing else did in that moment. She held them tightly, all 3 of them, her face resting against Dara's head as she breathed in deeply. Morning light filtered through the oak branches in soft, golden lines, settling over the table, over the girls, over Lenora's steady hands as they rested against their backs. Quiet proof that after everything, she had not just endured, she had won. It was golden, still, and filled with that rare kind of peace that only settles in after something heavy has finally come to an end. Nia looked up at her mother after a quiet moment and asked if everything was going to be okay now, not with the anxious uncertainty she had carried for months, but with a growing belief that the answer might finally be yes. Lenora met her gaze, reached up, and gently touched her face. Yes, she said, simply, clearly, without hesitation, the same way Nana Bay used to answer the questions that truly mattered. Yes, everything is going to be okay. They had mistaken her silence for emptiness. They had read her patience as weakness. But a woman who builds in silence, who carries her strength without display, who waits, not out of fear, but with intention, never needs to announce who she is. The truth reveals itself in time. The foundation speaks louder than any voice ever could. And when that moment comes, when the timing is finally right, everything that was once hidden has a way of opening all at once, exactly when it's meant to. If you saw a piece of yourself in Lenora, or in someone you love, share in the comments. What part stayed with you the most? Don't forget to like this video so more people can discover stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because every story we share here is told with intention. And pass this along because someone out there might need this reminder today.